if something had passed in front of it, but there was nothing there. I realized I was holding my breath. I exhaled slowly, trying to stay calm. My eyes stayed locked on the TV screen, waiting to see any movement. There was nothing visible, but I felt a presence like something was behind me. I turned my head quickly, but I still saw nothing. My legs felt weak, so I sat down on the couch. My body was tense. My hands were shaking a bit, and I wiped them on my pants. The living room was too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound. I tried to focus on that hum, but my thoughts were all over the place. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe my friend had pranked me somehow. But how would he manage a prank like this? He wasn't the type to go all in on such elaborate setups. And I'd locked the door. I kept telling myself it must be my nerves or an overactive imagination. Yet my senses were screaming that something else was in the apartment with me. I stood up and checked the door again, making sure it was locked tight. I even slid the chain into place. I pressed my ear against the door and listened. The hall was silent. I took a deep breath and stepped back. That's when I heard a faint shuffle coming from the bedroom. My bedroom door was half open. I had already checked the room before, so I felt a jolt of panic. I hurried down the small hallway leading to the bedroom. My heart was hammering and my limbs felt jittery. I flipped on the bedroom light. The bed was undisturbed, the dresser drawers were closed, and the closet door was shut. I opened the closet and shoved aside a few hanging shirts. No one was inside. Then I heard a faint creak from the corner near the window. It was the floorboard. I was sure of it. I turned to face that corner, but it was empty. The curtains were drawn, and there was nowhere for anyone to hide. Still, I heard that creak, so I stepped closer, trying to see if the floorboard might be loose. I pressed it with my foot. It moved slightly, but it made a similar sound. Maybe that was it. Maybe the wood was just settling. I closed my eyes for a second. My breathing was heavy and shallow, and I felt a slight sweat on my brow. I decided to leave the bedroom lights on and head back to the living room. On my way, I thought I saw a shifting shape at the end of the corridor near the front door. It was low to the ground, almost blending with the shadows. I stopped walking and stared at it. It didn't move, but I knew it was there. My mind was screaming to turn away, to not engage with it. But I couldn't ignore something creeping around my own place. I took a slow step forward, and the shape seemed to draw back, almost like it was recoiling. My pulse thundered in my ears. I took another step and it faded into the darkness near the door. I rushed to the living room again, flipping on every light I could. I grabbed my phone and dialed my friend's number, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a brief message, something like, "Dude, where are you? I need you to call me right now." My voice shook a little. I sat back down, trying to steady my breathing. My legs bounced restlessly and my hands couldn't stay still. The room felt like it was closing in on me. Every little sound made me jump. The clock ticking on the wall felt louder than usual. I wiped my forehead and noticed how clammy my skin was. After a few minutes of tense silence, I decided I couldn't just sit there anymore. I figured I'd grab my jacket and wait outside for my friend. At least in the hallway, I could see if someone approached. If that weird shadow was still out there, I'd deal with it in the open. I stood up and walked carefully to the front door. I looked through the peephole one last time. The corridor light flickered weakly, and the shadow was right in front of my door. It looked like an oval smear of darkness, lacking any definite shape. I felt a spike of adrenaline. I didn't want to open the door if this thing was right there, but I also didn't want to stay inside with whatever was making those sounds. My hand shook as I placed it on the doorknob. I took a breath, unlatched the chain, and turned the key. I swung the door open. The corridor light buzzed softly. The shadow was on the floor, but it pulled back a few inches. I stayed in the doorway, holding the door open, watching it. I could see it more clearly now. It didn't have edges or distinct features. It was a black blur that seemed to absorb the light around it. My head started to spin because this made no logical sense. I wanted to run, but my legs were rooted to the spot. I stepped forward, 1 foot outside. The shadow shifted away, inch by inch, as if it was cautious. I felt my chest tighten with fear, but I kept going. It moved a little farther down the hallway, then stopped. I held my breath, taking another step. Suddenly, it flickered once and vanished. I stood there staring at the spot where it had been. There was only the worn carpet and the dull glow of the corridor light. I walked up and down the hallway to see if it had moved around the corner. Nothing. My mind was racing and my heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I made my way back to my door, not wanting to linger outside if it decided to come back. When I stepped inside, the apartment felt ice cold again. I pushed the door shut, locked it, and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. That was when my phone buzzed. My friend finally texted, "Sorry, got held up. Coming in 5." I stared at the screen, not sure how to explain anything. I typed back, telling him I'd meet him downstairs. I didn't want to stay in that apartment any longer. I grabbed my jacket and wallet, and I walked through every room once more, making sure the lights were off except for the living room lamp. I left quickly, locking the door behind me. As I walked down the hallway, I kept checking over my shoulder. That shadow was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling it was nearby, watching. My heart was still pounding. I reached the elevator and pressed the button, glancing back at my door, expecting to see something. Nothing appeared. The elevator arrived, and I stepped in. On the ride down, my reflection in the stainless steel walls showed a sweaty, nervous face. I tried to breathe in and out slow and steady, but my hands were still shaking. My mind replayed every sound, every moment of that cold, eerie presence. I had no idea what it was. I just knew it had been real, because I felt it in my bones. When the elevator doors opened to the lobby, I stepped out and looked around. The normal lights and the random chatter from a few neighbors made me feel less afraid. I forced a small smile at the security guard, but he just nodded back. I waited near the entrance, checking my phone, waiting for my friend's arrival. My heart was still racing, and I felt a chill that wouldn't leave me. I kept expecting to see that shadow slide up behind me, but it never did. I had no explanation for what happened, and I still don't. But I know one thing. Something got inside my place without being seen in any normal way. It left no physical trace except the cold air and those strange sounds. It took a shape that wasn't shaped at all. Even now, I'm not sure how I'll walk back into that apartment without remembering the knocks and the way it hovered near my feet. But I have to go back. It's my home and I can't abandon it. That feeling of being watched, though, isn't going away anytime soon. I heard the footsteps on my first night. They were heavy and steady, as if someone large was pacing back and forth. I stopped what I was doing and listened hard. But there was no voice, no sign that anyone else was around. My heart thumped against my ribcage because I knew I was alone in that chalet. At least I had thought I was alone when I signed the guest book and saw my name printed on the only line. I had driven there to clear my head and work on a new story. I chose that chalet because it was buried deep in a mountainous region, far from crowds and traffic. When I pulled up on the first day, I noticed the wood panels on the exterior looked worn, and the windows had a few cracks along the edges. The surrounding trees were thick and tall, blocking most of the sunlight by mid-afternoon. I liked the isolation, I wanted peace, and I expected silence. The caretaker handed me a single key, told me the place was all mine, and left without much conversation. That first evening, I cooked a small dinner in the chalet's tiny kitchen. The counters were old, but clean enough. The faucet dripped a little, but I ignored it. I sat at the narrow table near the window and tried to relax. The temperature dropped once the sun went down, so I moved to the living area and turned on the old radiator. I opened my laptop, thinking I might start brainstorming a few ideas, but the slow internet connection frustrated me. I shut the laptop and decided to go to bed. I picked the bedroom on the ground floor because it was close to the bathroom and felt more comfortable. There were bedrooms upstairs, but the caretaker had mentioned that the top floor hadn't been used in a while. The bed creaked when I lay down. I remember staring at the dark ceiling and wondering how old the chalet really was. There was a faint smell of dust and old wood, but nothing too strong. At some point, I fell asleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a distinct thumping sound. My eyes snapped open. I stayed in bed for a few seconds, trying to figure out if it was a branch hitting the side of the chalet or maybe an animal scurrying around outside. Then the noise changed. It turned into the sound of heavy footsteps moving across the floor above me. I could imagine boots stomping from one side of the upstairs room to the other. My mouth went dry. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. There was no reason for anyone else to be there. I slid out of the bed and walked to the doorway. I flicked on the overhead light and it buzzed for a second before lighting up the small bedroom. The footsteps continued. I heard them cross from one end of the room to the other again. Part of me wanted to call the caretaker, but my phone had no signal, and the chalet's landline was in the living room. I figured I should check it out before I panicked. Maybe it was some kind of old house noise, though it sure didn't sound that way. I moved slowly down the hall, passing the bathroom. The living room was dark, lit only by the glow of a small lamp I had switched on earlier. The radiator hummed softly. I stood there, trying to pinpoint the direction of the sound. The footsteps were definitely upstairs. They paused, then started again, crossing overhead. My hands felt clammy, and I wiped them on my pajama pants. My heart pounded against my chest like it was trying to get out. I approached the staircase. The wood banister felt rough under my palm, and the steps squeaked as I put my weight on it. With each step, I expected the footsteps above to stop, but they kept going. There was something in the air that made my skin prickle, like a static charge. I climbed the stairs one by one, holding my breath. I could hear my own heartbeat. I thought about turning around, but I felt compelled to keep going. Maybe I needed to prove to myself that no one was there. At the top of the stairs, I stood in a narrow hallway with 2 doors on each side and a larger door at the end. The overhead light in the hallway was dim, flickering a little. The footsteps sounded closer now, but they seemed to be coming from the far room on the left. I walked toward it, feeling the floorboards flex under my feet. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open. The room was empty. A dusty bed frame sat against one wall. A window faced the mountains outside, and a small dresser leaned in the corner. The footsteps paused for a second. I listened, waiting for them to resume. Then I heard them above my head, like someone had moved onto the roof or the attic. I looked up, but there was just the ceiling with a single overhead light fixture. No attic door in sight, no ladder, nothing that would let someone climb up there. The sound knocked again, thud, 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 moving across the ceiling. I stepped back into the hallway, feeling a chill run through my arms. The caretaker had not mentioned an attic, just the upstairs bedrooms. The noise up there was distinct, though. It felt like it was guiding me further. I glanced around the hallway, looking for any access panel. There was a small hatch in the ceiling near the end of the hall, almost flush with the plaster. It was square, maybe a couple of feet on each side. I hadn't noticed it on my initial look around. It had no visible handle, just a crack. I stared at it, trying to decide if I should attempt to open it in the middle of the night. I reached for a nearby wooden chair that stood against the wall. I dragged it under the hatch. The wood scraped against the floor. I climbed on top of the chair, wobbling a bit. The hatch was just high enough that I could press my fingertips against the edge. I pushed and it gave way slightly. Dust and bits of debris fell onto my face, making me cough. I steadied myself and pushed the hatch open. Cold air drifted out, along with a stale smell. It reminded me of old paper and forgotten boxes. I could barely see inside. I reached my hand up, half expecting something to grab it, but I only felt the rough edges of old wooden beams. The footsteps overhead had stopped the moment I opened the hatch. My scalp tingled, and my breathing felt shallow. I knew I was about to climb into a dark, cramped space with no flashlight, but I wanted answers. I climbed back down, walked into the nearest bedroom, and checked the small nightstand. I found a flashlight there, an older model that flickered once before turning on. Back at the hatch, I used the flashlight to illuminate the opening. The beam cut through layers of dust. I saw wooden boards across a narrow space, maybe an attic. I grabbed the edges of the opening and tried to pull myself up. My arms strained as I lifted myself enough to rest my stomach on the edge. The hatch was tight, and I scraped my elbow on a splinter. I let out a sharp hiss but kept going. Eventually, I got my upper body through, then twisted around until I could pull my legs inside. My first impression was that it was pitch black except for the beam from my flashlight. I shone it around and saw piles of old newspapers, some boxes stacked in the corners, and a few thick cobwebs hanging from the beams. The ceiling in the attic was slanted, following the roof's shape. I had to stoop to avoid hitting my head on the rafters. The floor felt rough under my feet. I took a few steps forward, shining the flashlight in every direction. The footprints I heard earlier were gone, and the place was silent except for my own breathing. My pulse was still racing. My hands shook a little, making the flashlight beam tremble. I inched further, stepping around boxes and loose boards. The attic wasn't large, but it was cluttered. I didn't see any sign of a person. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded hollow. No one responded. I stood there for a few seconds, considering the possibility that I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the noise was the wind or some structural movement. I was about to turn around and head back down when I caught sight of a narrow gap in the far corner of the attic. It looked like a small door or panel set into the wall. I walked over, carefully navigating over some broken boards. The panel was made of a different kind of wood than the rest of the walls. It had a latch, but no lock. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck. I lifted the latch, and the panel swung open. The opening led to a cramped storage area behind the attic wall. My flashlight illuminated a narrow space with no real flooring, just insulation and beams. There was a large trunk there, covered in a layer of dust so thick it looked gray. I stared at it, wondering why it was there. The footsteps that led me here had vanished. Still, my nerves were on edge, and the hair on my arm stood up. I carefully crossed a beam and knelt next to the trunk. The hinges were rusty but moved when I lifted the lid. I angled the flashlight inside and saw old clothes, some wooden carvings, and a stack of faded pictures. They smelled damp and stale. I lifted a piece of cloth. It felt rough. I moved it aside and found what looked like a journal with a cracked leather cover. I reached for it and flipped it open. The pages were yellowed, and the handwriting was hard to read in the dim light, but I could make out some dates from decades ago. My eyes scanned a few lines. They mentioned someone hearing noises in the chalet at night. There was also a mention of footsteps overhead, just like what I had heard. I felt a sudden urge to get out of there. My head was pounding with tension. I didn't like the cramped space or the stale air. I closed the trunk, left the panel open, and turned around. My plan was to climb back out of the attic and return to my room. Then I heard a creak behind me. It sounded like something shifting on a beam. My chest tightened and I froze. I swung the flashlight around. I saw nothing move, but the beam caught something reflective near the trunk. I stepped closer. I realized it was just a piece of broken glass leaning against the trunk's side. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I felt jumpy. My breathing came fast and my mouth felt dry again. I made my way back to the hatch, nearly stumbling once on a loose board. When I reached the hatch, I could see the hallway light shining up from below. It gave me relief. I knelt down, lowered my legs through the opening, and climbed down onto the chair. My feet touched the floor. I was back in the hallway. My face and arms were covered in dust, and my shirt stuck to my skin from sweat. I felt like I needed a shower, but I also wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything else up there. The footsteps had led me all the way to that hidden panel, but why had they stopped? I flipped the hallway light switch on and off, testing it, still uneasy. Then I closed the hatch, pushing it back into place until it clicked. I stood on my toes to see if it had any lock or latch from below, but it didn't. I grabbed the chair and set it aside. My body felt tense and my mind kept replaying the sound of those steps. The corridor felt quiet now, almost too quiet. I returned to the empty bedroom where I had first heard the footsteps above. The room looked dull and unremarkable under the overhead light. The bed frame sat there, the dresser, the window with a view of the dark mountains. Everything looked normal. I walked back down the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. My knees felt a bit shaky. I think the fear and the adrenaline were wearing off. In the living room, I placed the flashlight on the table and sank into the old couch. The cushion sank under me, and I realized how exhausted I was. I didn't want to think about what could be walking around upstairs. I checked the time on my phone. It was almost 3 in the morning, and there was still no signal. I glanced at the landline phone on the desk nearby. The caretaker's number was on a small card next to it. I considered calling, but it felt pointless to wake him up when I wasn't even sure what I had heard. Besides, I didn't want to sound like a frightened guest who was spooked by old house noises. I decided to stay on the couch for the rest of the night. I grabbed a blanket from my bedroom, pulled it over me, and tried to doze off. My thoughts kept returning to the footsteps. They had a deliberate rhythm, like someone pacing with a purpose. I also couldn't forget the dusty trunk and the journal mentioning footsteps. Somebody else had experienced this maybe years ago. There was no explanation in that short excerpt, just a note about hearing them. I wondered if that was the only mention or if there were more details deeper in the journal. But at that moment I was too drained to climb up there again. I lay there on the couch, my eyes darting around the room, scanning every shadow, waiting for another sound. The night passed slowly. The radiator hummed and I jumped at every small creak the chalet made. My heart raced whenever I thought I heard something move above me. Eventually, the first hints of dawn lightened the windows. I sat up, feeling stiff and unrested. The footsteps hadn't returned that night, but I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone in that place. That morning, I made some coffee, noticing my hands trembled a bit when I tried to pour water into the machine. I stood by the window, looking out at the mountains. My mind drifted to that attic again. The presence I felt seemed to want me to find something. Maybe it was that trunk, or maybe there was more hidden up there. I planned to check it again after I had some caffeine and a moment to steady my nerves. I was there to write, but now I felt stuck in a mystery that made my pulse pound. My next move was to return upstairs in daylight, armed with better lighting and a clearer head. I wanted to see if there was anything else in that attic space. Whatever it was, those footsteps didn't feel like a random house noise. They felt personal, like they were meant for me to follow. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face that, but I was certain I couldn't ignore it. Something in that chalet was calling me up step by step, and I had to find out why. I never expected to see my own face in an old portrait, but that's exactly what happened one Saturday at a local antique fair. I was walking through rows of dusty furniture, chipped tea sets, and worn-out books when I spotted it. The painting hung on a makeshift wooden wall under a flickering light. The vendor told me it had no real story attached, but the resemblance was obvious. The man in the picture looked like me, though his clothes belonged to a much older time. His hair was styled differently and his posture felt stiff, like he was posing for an official portrait. I couldn't turn away. I bought it on the spot and took it home. I didn't think it would change my life, but it did. When I got home, I placed the painting in the middle of my living room. I moved a couple of my usual decorations to fit it on the wall opposite my couch. I didn't notice anything weird right away. It was just an antique painting, a little faded with a dark wooden frame. The vendor had said it was at least a century old. I just found it interesting, especially because it looked so much like me. I had no explanation for that. Maybe it was a coincidence. I didn't question it for long. I was more interested in how it would look on the wall. That first night I turned off the lights around 11. My living room windows faced the street, and I had a street lamp right outside. Light came in through the gaps of my blinds. I kept glancing at the painting because I couldn't sleep. There was a faint sheen in the painted eyes. It looked like a slight reflection. At the time, I figured it was just the street lamp. I got up, walked closer, and checked. The eyes in the painting seemed to glimmer. I felt a short rush of tension in my gut, but I brushed it off. I assumed the varnish on the surface was reflecting light. A few nights passed without major incidents, but I developed a habit of looking at the painting before bed. Something about it made me uneasy. My palms felt clammy whenever I was close to it at night. The eyes had a strange depth. The painting showed this man wearing a dark jacket with a stiff collar. He had a neutral expression, neither happy nor sad. But sometimes when I blinked or when the room lights changed, I thought his mouth had shifted. On Wednesday night, I swore I saw his lips curve into a slight smirk. It was so subtle I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I turned on every light in the living room to double-check. The expression looked normal again. I tried to shrug it off as my mind messing with me. By Friday, I started feeling strange just walking past it in the morning. The painting had a stiff energy during the day, but it felt more intense at night. Around midnight, I lay on the couch struggling with insomnia. I heard the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing outside. I caught myself staring at the painting's face. The eyes seemed to watch me. I rubbed my own eyes. Then I realized I was holding my breath. I tried to calm myself. I got up for a glass of water, hoping the motion would help me break that uneasy feeling. After I drank some water, I stepped back into the living room. I felt a chill. My hair stood up on my arms. I could have sworn the man in the painting winked at me. It was so fast I almost doubted it, but I felt my heart pound. My mouth went dry. A warm flush crept up my neck. I told myself it was an illusion caused by the flickering streetlight outside. I tried not to think about it, but I ended up lying awake for another hour, staring at the ceiling, feeling restless. Over the next few days, I developed a subtle dread about going into my own living room. On Monday, I tried to work from home. My desk is in the corner of that room, so I couldn't avoid seeing the painting. At around noon, sunlight was pouring in. The portrait's expression appeared normal. The background was a dark, brownish color. The face was pale, with fine brushstrokes for the cheekbones. The eyes were a dark greenish brown. The eyebrows had a slight arch. While typing on my laptop, I felt as if someone was watching me. I turned around and stared at the painting. It looked unchanged, but I felt a strange pressure in my chest. My breathing got shallow and I felt my fingers tremble. I told myself to ignore it. That evening, I tried to unwind with a few episodes of a comedy show. I turned on the TV, but I couldn't focus. My attention kept drifting to the painting. The corners of his mouth looked different again. It was a slight downturn now, almost like a frown. I paused the show, got up, and walked over. I leaned in close. The brush strokes around his lips weren't any different than I remembered. It seemed impossible for the expression to shift, yet it did. I felt my skin crawl. I decided to cover the painting with an old blanket. As soon as I did, I let out a long exhale. My shoulders relaxed a bit. I left it covered for 2 days. During that time, I slept better. I tried to forget about it. The house felt normal without seeing those eyes. But part of me kept thinking about it. On Thursday afternoon, curiosity got the best of me. I removed the blanket. It was broad daylight, so I felt safer. I stood there, studying the painting. It looked static again. The man's face was neutral. I even thought I might have exaggerated the entire thing in my head. So I decided to keep it uncovered just to prove I could handle it. That night, the tension returned. Around 10 p.m., I walked through the living room with the lights off. The painting's eyes caught a sliver of light coming from the kitchen. They looked glossy like real eyes in the dark. My heartbeat sped up. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept tossing and turning. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that face staring at me. It felt intrusive. My heart wouldn't slow down. I got out of bed around midnight, deciding I'd just go watch some late-night TV until I got tired. I stepped into the living room and froze. My stomach clenched. The painting's face looked furious. His brows were angled in a sharp line. The lips were pressed together. That was completely different from the neutral look I saw earlier. I felt the blood rush to my head. My hands shook, and I grabbed the back of the couch for support. I considered throwing the painting out that night, but I thought about how much I spent on it. I also felt a strange pull, It was like I couldn't just get rid of it so easily. I decided to store it in a closet for a while. I took it down from the wall, walked carefully to the hallway closet, and leaned it against the back wall behind some coats. The closet was dark. I tried not to look at it as I closed the door. For the next 2 days, I didn't see the painting at all. I kept the closet door shut. I tried to focus on my usual routines. I even invited a friend over on Saturday. We ordered takeout, watched a movie, and I tried to act normal. But I felt this strange weight in my house. I knew the painting was just a few steps away. It felt like having a ticking clock in a box that you can't see, but you know it's there. My shoulders were tense the entire time, and I kept checking the hallway door. My friend asked if I was feeling okay. I lied and said I was fine. Late that night, I woke up around 3 a.m. sweating. I felt an urge to check the closet. I didn't want to, but it was like an itch I couldn't ignore. My mouth felt dry, and my pulse throbbed in my temples. I walked over in the dark. My legs felt stiff. I opened the closet door a crack. The hallway light was off, so I couldn't see much. I switched on the hallway light. I saw the edge of the frame behind the coats. Something made me pull the coats aside. The painting was there, facing me. A chill ran down my spine. My vision blurred for a second. The face looked hollow. His eyes had no sparkle. The mouth was open slightly as though he was about to speak. My heart hammered and I slammed the closet door shut. I didn't sleep much after that. I lay in bed, feeling my pulse racing. I stared at the ceiling until morning. My stomach hurt. I felt sweaty and cold at the same time. By Sunday afternoon, I decided I had to get rid of the painting. My plan was to take it to a storage facility or maybe even return it to the antique fair. But deep down, I worried no one would believe me. I wasn't even sure if I believed myself. All I knew was that I felt scared in my own home. I forced myself to open the closet again. My hands shook when I pulled the painting out. I tried not to look at the face, but I caught a glimpse. It looked neutral again, though there was a slight tilt to the eyebrows, like a suspicious look. I am the storyteller. I felt my breathing speed up today. I stuffed the painting into a large fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The old wooden bridge groaned beneath our unsteady feet, like the spine of some ancient beast disturbed from its slumber. 4 of us stumbled across its weathered planks. Marcus, Danny, Jake, and myself, our laughter echoing hollow in the thick autumn air that hung over Miller's Creek like a shroud. The alcohol had made everything feel both sharper and softer somehow, the way whiskey tends to blur the edges of reality while magnifying every sensation. It was Marcus who suggested we stop halfway across. The bridge stretched nearly 200 feet over the narrow gorge, its wooden railings worn smooth by decades of hands that had gripped them in wonder, fear, or desperation. Below us, the creek moved like black silk in the moonlight, and somewhere in that darkness, the perfect conditions existed for what Marcus called the best dam echo in 3 counties. The mist rose from the water in ghostly tendrils, and I remember thinking how it seemed to reach for us with fingers of vapor, probing and curious. The night felt wrong somehow, though I couldn't articulate why. Perhaps it was the way the usual sounds of the forest had fallen silent, or how the moon cast shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Even in my alcohol-hazed state, some primitive part of my brain was sending up warning flares. Marcus leaned against the railing, his breath forming small clouds in the chill air. He was always the loudest of our group, the one who never met a silence he couldn't fill with his voice. Danny and Jake flanked him on either side while I hung back slightly, suddenly feeling like an observer rather than a participant in whatever was about to unfold. The gorge below us seemed to breathe with its own rhythm, the mist pulsing and swirling in patterns that made my eyes water when I tried to follow them. The wooden planks beneath my feet felt unstable, though I knew the bridge had stood for over 50 years. Every fiber seemed to vibrate with some frequency just below the threshold of hearing, like the low rumble of distant thunder that you feel in your chest before your ears register the sound. Marcus cupped his hands around his mouth, the universal gesture of someone about to make noise they probably shouldn't. The anticipation hung in the air like the mist below us, thick and expectant. In that moment before he shouted, I had the strangest sensation of standing on the edge of something far more significant than a wooden bridge over a creek. It felt like a threshold, a boundary between what was and what could be. When Marcus finally called out his name, his voice cut through the night air with startling clarity. "Marcus!" he bellowed, the sound rolling down into the gorge with authority and purpose. We waited, all of us leaning forward slightly, ears straining for the familiar bounce of sound off stone and water that would send his voice back to us transformed but recognizable. The silence stretched longer than it should have. In a gorge like this, with perfect acoustic conditions, the echo should have returned within seconds, but we waited and waited until the very air seemed to thicken around us with anticipation. Danny shifted nervously beside me, his earlier enthusiasm dampened by the unnatural quiet that had swallowed Marcus's shout. Then it came back. "Marcus Ashworth!" The voice that returned to us was definitely human, definitely male, but it carried a resonance that made my spine crawl. It was louder than Marcus's original call, richer somehow, as if it had been filtered through something that had given it weight and substance it hadn't possessed before. But more disturbing than the enhanced volume was the addition of that surname, Ashworth, a name none of us had ever heard before, certainly not one that belonged to any of us. Marcus stepped back from the railing as if it had suddenly become electrified. The color drained from his face even in the pale moonlight, and I watched as his hands began to tremble. Danny let out a nervous laugh that died quickly in the oppressive air, while Jake just stared down into the mist as if he could will an explanation to materialize from its depths. I felt my heart rate accelerate, the alcohol in my system suddenly seeming inadequate to dull the sharp edge of fear that was beginning to slice through my consciousness. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps someone else was down there. Perhaps the acoustic properties of the gorge had somehow distorted the sound. Perhaps we had all simply misheard what came back to us. But deep down, in that primitive part of the brain that had kept our ancestors alive through countless dark nights, I knew that something was fundamentally wrong with what had just occurred. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice smaller now, uncertain. He suggested that maybe it was just a weird echo, that sometimes sound could play tricks in places like this. But even as he spoke, I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes, the way his gaze kept flicking back to the railing as if expecting something to emerge from the mist below. Danny was the next to try. His voice cracked slightly as he called his own name down into the gorge, and this time we didn't have to wait as long. The response came back swift and sure. "Danny Ashworth." The same enhanced volume, the same impossible surname that belonged to none of us. Danny stumbled backward so quickly he nearly knocked Jake over, his face a mask of confusion and growing terror. The mist below us seemed to swirl with more purpose now, forming shapes that almost looked like faces before dissolving back into shapeless vapor. The wooden bridge beneath our feet felt less stable with each passing moment, as if the very foundations of reality were beginning to shift and warp around us. Jake volunteered next, though his voice shook as he made the offer. When he shouted his name into the darkness, the response that came back, "Jake Ashworth," sent all of us stumbling toward the center of the bridge, away from the railings that suddenly felt like the edges of an abyss that might swallow us whole. The night air had grown thick and oppressive, pressing down on us like a physical weight. My skin felt clammy despite the chill, and I became hyper-aware of every sensation: the rough texture of the wooden planks beneath my feet, the metallic taste of fear on my tongue, the way the mist seemed to be reaching higher now, as if trying to climb up from the gorge to where we stood. They all turned to look at me then, expecting me to complete whatever ritual we had unknowingly begun. But I found myself backing away from the railing, every instinct screaming at me not to add my voice to whatever conversation was taking place between our world and whatever existed in that swirling darkness below. The silence stretched between us, heavy with expectation and growing dread. Marcus urged me to try, insisting that there had to be a reasonable explanation for what was happening. Danny nodded agreement, though his eyes held the wide, bright quality of someone trying very hard to convince himself of something he didn't quite believe. But I couldn't shake the feeling that calling my name down into that mist would be crossing a line from which there would be no return. The surname Ashworth rang in my ears like a bell tolling for something I couldn't name, and every fiber of my being rebelled against the idea of claiming it as my own, even by proxy. As we stood there in indecision, the mist below began to take on a more solid appearance, forming shapes that were almost human but not quite right. The proportions were wrong, the movements too fluid, as if whatever was down there was wearing the form of humanity like an ill-fitting garment. The bridge began to sway slightly, though there was no wind to account for the movement. The groaning of the old wood took on a different quality, less like the settling of aged timber, and more like the sound of something breathing, something alive and aware of our presence. I found myself backing further away from the railings, pulling my friends with me toward what I hoped was the safety of solid ground. But as we moved, I realized with growing horror that I couldn't remember which direction we had come from. The bridge stretched away from us in both directions, disappearing into a mist that had somehow risen to our level, obscuring the approaches that should have led back to familiar territory. The shapes in the fog were becoming more distinct now, more purposeful in their movements. They seemed to be climbing, rising from whatever depths they had inhabited, drawn perhaps by our voices or our presence, or the very fact that we had somehow called them into being by speaking names that weren't ours to claim. Marcus grabbed my arm, his grip tight with desperation, urging me to say something, to do something that might break the spell we had apparently cast. But I found myself frozen, paralyzed by the certainty that whatever was happening to us was far beyond our understanding or control. The mist had reached the level of the bridge now, swirling around our feet like seeking fingers. It was warm, I realized with surprise, much warmer than the chill night air, and it seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, its own life. The shapes within it were more solid now, more present, and I could almost make out faces in the swirling gray. Faces that might have been human once but had been changed by whatever force existed in the depths of the gorge. Then I heard it. My own name, called from somewhere within the mist, though none of my friends had spoken. The voice was my own but not my own, familiar yet alien, and it was followed by that same surname that had claimed each of my friends in turn. The echo had found me without my permission, without my voice to guide it, and as it spoke my name with that impossible addition, I felt something fundamental shift inside me, as if some essential part of who I was had been altered by the very act of hearing it. The mist began to recede then, sinking back toward the creek below, taking with it the shapes and shadows that had risen to meet us. But as it withdrew, I realized with growing horror that I couldn't remember my actual surname anymore. The name Ashworth filled that space in my memory completely, as if it had always been mine, as if the person I had been before setting foot on this bridge was nothing more than a half-remembered dream. My friends were staring at me with expressions I couldn't read, their faces seeming somehow unfamiliar despite having known them for years. When Danny spoke, asking if I was all right, his voice sounded different too, as if it was coming from somewhere far away, or being filtered through something that changed its very nature. We made our way off the bridge eventually, though I can't recall the journey with any clarity. What I remember is the feeling of walking through a world that had been subtly but irrevocably altered, where the familiar landmarks of my life had been shifted just enough to make everything feel foreign and strange. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it had all been the product of too much alcohol and too active an imagination. But the name Ashworth had lodged itself in my mind like a splinter, and no amount of rational thought could dislodge it. Worse still, I began to find evidence of its presence in my life. Documents and identification that bore the surname I was certain I had never owned. Friends and family who insisted they had always known me by that name. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, I can still hear that voice calling from the mist, claiming me with a name that doesn't belong to me but has somehow become mine. And I wonder if somewhere in the darkness below that old wooden bridge, there's someone else standing at a railing, calling out their name and receiving in return the echo of who I used to be. The bridge still stands, and sometimes I drive past it on my way to work or to run errands in town. But I never stop, and I never look too closely at the mist that rises from Miller's Creek in the early morning hours. Because I'm afraid of what I might see there, afraid of what might be looking back at me from depths that exist in the spaces between what is and what should never be. And late at night, when the world is quiet, and the boundary between dream and reality grows thin, I sometimes catch myself wondering who I really am, and whether the person I remember being before that night on the bridge ever existed at all. Story 2. The Whitmore State Hospital had been closed for 37 years when I first walked through its converted entrance, now bearing a polished brass plaque that read, Museum of Mental Health History. The October rain drummed against the Gothic windows, each drop like a fingertip tapping against glass, as if something outside wanted in, or something inside wanted out. I adjusted my intern badge and checked my watch. 3:15. Dr. Brennan had given me until 6 to complete my research on early electroconvulsive therapy practices for my thesis. The museum director, a skeletal woman with wire-rimmed glasses, had handed me a set of keys and directions to the basement archives with the enthusiasm of someone disposing of medical waste. The lobby retained its institutional bones beneath the museum's cosmetic renovations. Terrazzo floors stretched endlessly, their surface worn smooth by decades of shuffling feet. The walls had been painted a cheerful yellow, but underneath, I could see the ghosts of old paint, institutional green bleeding through like bruises. The smell lingered too. Industrial disinfectant couldn't quite mask the deeper odors of decades of human suffering, fear, and confinement. I descended the main staircase, my footsteps echoing in the hollow space. The basement archives were located in what had once been the hydrotherapy wing, where patients had been subjected to ice baths and high-pressure water treatments. The hallway stretched before me, lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs that flickered sporadically, casting dancing shadows on the walls. It was here, as I reached for the steel handrail to steady myself on the uneven steps, that I first noticed the elevator. The building had 4 passenger elevators, all of which had been decommissioned when the hospital closed. Their doors were sealed with metal plates welded shut, and prominent signs warned against their use. Yet as my palm touched the cold steel of the handrail, I heard the distinct mechanical wheeze of elevator machinery groaning to life. I paused, listening. The sound came again, cables moving, gears turning, the soft ding of floors being passed. I followed the sound to the nearest elevator shaft and pressed my ear against the sealed doors. The car was definitely moving, descending with deliberate purpose. When it stopped, silence returned so abruptly that I questioned whether I had heard anything at all. The archives were a maze of filing cabinets and storage boxes, illuminated by a single bare bulb that swayed gently in the ventilation current. I settled at a metal desk and began sorting through patient files from the 1940s and 50s, taking notes on treatment protocols and outcomes. The work was methodical, almost meditative, and I lost myself in the clinical language that reduced human suffering to neat categories and numbered procedures. It was nearly 5 o'clock when I became aware that I was no longer alone. The feeling crept over me gradually, like cold water rising around my ankles. The sensation of being watched was so strong that I looked up from my work, expecting to see the museum director or a security guard. Instead, I saw nothing but shadows and the weak glow of the exit sign at the far end of the hallway. But something was there. I couldn't see it clearly, just a shape in my peripheral vision, a figure standing motionless in the darkness beyond the archive room's entrance. When I turned my head to look directly, it seemed to melt back into the shadows, leaving only the suggestion of movement and the faint sound of fabric rustling. I convinced myself it was paranoia, brought on by spending too much time in a place where so many people had lost their grip on reality. The mind, I told myself, was susceptible to suggestion, especially in environments associated with mental illness. I returned to my work, but my concentration was broken. Every few minutes I found myself glancing up, scanning the shadows for movement. The figure appeared again as I was packing up my notes. This time, I forced myself to look directly at it. to confront whatever trick my mind was playing. What I saw made my mouth go dry. It was definitely human in shape, but wrong in every detail. The figure wore what appeared to be a dark hooded garment, but where a face should have been, there was only an empty void. Not darkness, absence, as if someone had cut a hole in reality itself. The figure stood perfectly still, and when I counted the distance between us, I realized it was exactly 20 steps away. I blinked, and it was gone. My hands shook as I gathered my materials. The rational part of my mind cataloged possible explanations: fatigue, eye strain, the power of suggestion. The basement of a former mental hospital was exactly the kind of place where imagination could run wild. But as I climbed the stairs toward the exit, my fingers trailing along the steel handrail for support, the elevator machinery groaned to life again. This time, I was certain. The sound was unmistakable, cables moving, the car descending through its shaft with mechanical precision. I stopped climbing and listened as the elevator car passed floor after floor, heading down into the depths of the building. When it stopped, the silence that followed felt pregnant with possibility. Over the next 3 days, I returned to the museum to continue my research. Each visit brought new encounters with the hooded figure. It appeared in my peripheral vision, always at the same distance, never moving closer or farther away. 20 steps. I began to measure the distance obsessively, pacing it off whenever I spotted the figure. 20 steps exactly, every time. The elevator incidents became more frequent. Every time I touched the steel handrail, whether on the main staircase, the fire escape, or the basement steps, the dead elevators would respond. The sounds were always the same: the mechanical groan of awakening machinery, the steady descent, the final stop somewhere below the basement level where no floors were supposed to exist. I researched the building's history more thoroughly, diving into architectural plans and maintenance records. The original blueprints showed only 3 basement levels, but the elevator sounds suggested the car was traveling much deeper. I found references to a sub-basement level that had been sealed in 1963, but no explanation for why. Sleep became elusive. I would lie in my apartment, listening to the night sounds of the city, and imagine I could hear the distant groaning of elevator machinery. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked increasingly haggard, and I caught myself checking over my shoulder constantly, even in my own home. On my 5th visit to the museum, I decided to test my sanity. I brought a digital camera and a voice recorder, determined to document whatever was happening to me. If I was losing my mind, at least I would have evidence of the process. The hooded figure appeared within minutes of my arrival in the archives. I raised the camera and took several photographs, the flash briefly illuminating the empty hallway. When I reviewed the images on the camera's display, they showed nothing but shadows and filing cabinets. The figure remained visible to my naked eye, standing motionless in its usual position, but the camera saw only emptiness. I spoke aloud, describing what I was seeing for the voice recorder. My voice sounded strange in the empty space, too loud and too clear. I described the figure's position, its lack of facial features, the way it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When I played back the recording, my voice was there, but the description sounded like the ravings of someone losing their grip on reality. The elevator incident that followed was the most disturbing yet. As I touched the handrail to ascend from the basement, not only did the machinery start up, but I could swear I heard something else. The sound of doors opening and closing, as if someone, or something, was getting on or off the elevator as it made its impossible journey. I began to research the hospital's patient records more specifically, looking for patterns that might explain what I was experiencing. What I found chilled me more than any supernatural explanation could have. In 1962, a patient named Marcus Holloway had been subjected to an experimental treatment involving sensory deprivation and electroshock therapy. The treatment had been designed to reset his perception of reality, to cure him of what doctors labeled as persistent hallucinations. Holloway had claimed that he was being followed by a figure without a face, a presence that maintained a constant distance of exactly 20 steps. The treatment had been a failure. Holloway's condition had worsened, and he had become convinced that the figure was not a hallucination, but something real that only he could see. He had died during the final treatment session, not from the electroshock therapy itself, but from what the records described as acute cardiac arrest brought on by extreme psychological distress. After Holloway's death, several staff members had reported strange incidents in the building. Elevators operating without power, shadows that moved independently of their sources, the sound of footsteps following them through empty corridors, always maintaining the same distance. The hospital had sealed the sub-basement level where Holloway's treatments had taken place, claiming it was due to structural concerns. The sealed elevator access was the only way to reach that floor. As I read Holloway's file, the temperature in the archive room seemed to drop several degrees. I looked up from the papers to find the hooded figure standing closer than ever before, not 20 steps away, but perhaps 15. For the first time, it seemed to be looking directly at me, though I still couldn't make out any features beneath the hood. I tried to stand, to back away, but found my legs wouldn't respond. The figure began to move, not walking but gliding across the floor with fluid motion. As it approached, I could smell something cold and metallic, like the interior of a morgue. 12 steps. 10. 8. The lights went out. In the darkness, I heard my own voice speaking words I wasn't choosing to say, describing the approach of something that shouldn't exist. The voice recorder was still running, documenting my descent into madness, or my encounter with something far worse than insanity. When the lights flickered back on, I was alone. The hooded figure was gone, but the patient file in my hands had changed. Where Marcus Holloway's name had been, I now saw my own name typed in the same typeface, dated yesterday. The diagnosis read, persistent hallucinations, probable cause, exposure to environmental triggers in former treatment facility. I dropped the file and ran from the archives, taking the stairs 3 at a time. Behind me, I could hear the elevator machinery starting up again, but this time it sounded different. Not mechanical, but almost organic, like breathing. The sound followed me up the stairs, through the lobby, and out into the October rain. As I reached my car, I looked back at the museum. In one of the upper windows, I could see a dark figure watching me. Even at this distance, I knew it was exactly 20 steps from where I had been standing inside the building. I never returned to complete my research. My thesis advisor accepted my explanation that the archives were incomplete and assigned me a different topic. But sometimes, when I'm walking down a hallway or climbing a staircase, I hear the sound of elevator machinery groaning to life behind sealed doors. And sometimes, just at the edge of my vision, I catch a glimpse of a dark hood maintaining its eternal distance. The question that haunts me isn't whether Marcus Holloway died from his delusions or from something real that had been following him. The question is whether the treatment was designed to cure his hallucinations or to make him stop seeing something that was actually there. I've counted the steps from my apartment door to the elevator in my building. 20 steps exactly. The elevator has been out of order for 3 days now, but I still hear it running at night. Story 3. The industrial hum of the restaurant's ventilation system had become my lullaby over the past 18 months. Working as sous chef at Meridian meant 12-hour shifts that bled into one another, the line between day and night dissolving in the fluorescent glare of the kitchen. The break room, what we generously called the Copa, was my only sanctuary, a cramped space tucked behind the walk-in freezer where the staff could grab 5 minutes of peace between the dinner rush chaos. That Tuesday evening started like any other. The autumn rain hammered against the restaurant's windows, creating a steady percussion that mixed with the clatter of plates and the sharp bark of orders from the pass. My hands moved automatically through the familiar motions, julienning carrots, checking sauce consistency, calling out ticket times, while my mind wandered to the growing pile of bills on my kitchen counter at home. The promotion to head chef seemed perpetually just out of reach, dangling like a carrot I could never quite grasp. During the brief lull between prep and service, I ducked into the Copa to grab a coffee. The small television mounted in the corner had been broken for weeks, its screen flickering with static whenever someone bothered to turn it on. But something compelled me to reach for the remote that evening. Maybe the desire for background noise to cut through the oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. The screen flickered to life, and I expected the usual static, or maybe a local news station if we were lucky. Instead, I found myself staring at an image that made my coffee cup pause halfway to my lips. There I was, standing in the exact spot where I now stood, wearing the same stained apron, the same expression of mild confusion creasing my features. But the version of me on screen moved with a strange, mechanical quality, as if operating on a slight delay. I raised my hand to my face, and 3 seconds later, the televised version of myself did the same. My rational mind immediately supplied explanations. A security camera feed somehow crossed with the television signal, some kind of digital loop or malfunction. But as I flipped through the channels, the same impossible scene played out on every station. Channel 4, Channel 7, the local PBS affiliate, all showed me standing in the Copa, watching myself on television, trapped in an infinite regression that made my vision blur around the edges. The sensation of being observed crept up my spine like cold fingers. I spun around, expecting to find a camera mounted somewhere in the Copa, but the walls held only the usual detritus of restaurant life: employee schedules, health department notices, and a motivational poster featuring a kitten that someone had defaced with a Sharpie. No cameras, no logical explanation for what pulsed on the screen behind me. I turned back to the television. The other me, the delayed me, was also looking around the room with the same growing unease. His movements mirrored mine perfectly, but always those crucial 3 seconds behind, as if he existed in a pocket universe where time moved like honey. When I reached out to touch the screen, he reached out too, and for a moment I expected our fingertips to meet through the glass. Instead, my fingers met only the cold, static-charged surface while his hand moved through empty air. The break room door banged open, making me jump. Marcus, one of the line cooks, poked his head in. "Chef, we need you on the line. Ticket machine's going crazy." I glanced back at the screen. The delayed version of myself was still standing there, but now he was looking toward where the door would open. 3 seconds later, just as Marcus had appeared, my television doppelganger turned his head toward the entrance. The timing was perfect, terrifying, and impossible. "Yeah, I'll be right there," I managed, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. Marcus nodded and disappeared back into the controlled chaos of the kitchen. I looked at the screen one more time. The other me was alone again, but now he was reaching for something off camera. I realized with a jolt that he was turning off the television. 3 seconds later, my hand moved almost involuntarily to the power button. The screen went black. The dinner rush provided a welcome distraction, the familiar rhythm of coordinating orders and managing the line pushing the strange encounter to the back of my mind. But during quiet moments, when I paused to wipe sweat from my forehead or stepped back to survey the kitchen, I felt eyes on me. Not the usual awareness of cameras and staff, but something more intimate and invasive. Several times I caught myself glancing toward the Copa, half expecting to see my own face peering out from the doorway. During the next break, I found myself drawn back to the television like a moth to flame. This time I told myself I would document what I saw, maybe record it on my phone to prove I wasn't losing my mind. The screen flickered on, and there I was again, standing in the exact same spot, holding my phone in the exact same position. The delayed me was also holding a phone, also preparing to record. I started the recording. 3 seconds later, so did he. The video captured everything. My face, the Copa around me, the television screen showing myself holding a phone. But when I played it back, something was wrong. The video showed me in the Copa, alone, staring at a television screen filled with static. No delayed version of myself, no impossible loop. Just a man standing in a break room, filming nothing. But I had seen it. I was still seeing it, even as the playback showed only static. The disconnect between what my eyes perceived and what the camera recorded sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the industrial air conditioning. I saved the video anyway, a piece of evidence that proved only that evidence itself couldn't be trusted. Over the following days, the phenomenon became routine. Every time I entered the copa, every time I turned on the television, there I was, 3 seconds behind, trapped in my own delayed existence. I began timing the delay, testing it with various movements and gestures. The lag never varied. Exactly 3 seconds, no matter what I did. I started avoiding the copa during busy periods, but the knowledge of the television's presence gnawed at me like a splinter. During slower moments, I found excuses to check on it, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The delayed version of myself seemed to be developing a life of its own, sometimes making slightly different movements, as if he was beginning to deviate from the script of my actions. Sleep became elusive. At home, I found myself wondering if my television there would show the same impossible scene. I couldn't bring myself to find out. Instead, I covered the screen with a blanket and tried to forget the weight of invisible eyes that seemed to follow me from room to room. The real terror began when I started seeing the delay in other places. Mirrors in the restaurant's bathroom showed my reflection a fraction of a second behind my movements. The steel surfaces of prep tables caught my image with that same mechanical delay. Even the polished side of pots and pans reflected a version of myself that lagged behind reality by those crucial 3 seconds. I mentioned it to no one. How could I explain that I was being stalked by my own delayed reflection? That every surface in the restaurant had become a window into a parallel existence where I lived 3 seconds in the past? The rational part of my mind insisted it was stress, fatigue, maybe some kind of neurological issue brought on by too many 14-hour days and too little sleep. But the rational part of my mind was losing the battle. The breaking point came during a particularly hectic Friday night service. The kitchen was in full swing, every burner occupied, every member of the team moving in the practice choreography of professional food service. I was plating a lamb dish when I caught sight of my reflection in the sauce pot's surface. There I was, 3 seconds behind, but this time I wasn't plating the same dish. The delayed me was holding a different plate, preparing different food, as if he had diverged from my timeline entirely. I dropped the plate. The crash sent sauce splattering across the floor, drawing startled looks from the line cooks. But I barely noticed. I was staring at the pot, watching the delayed version of myself continue his own separate task, oblivious to the chaos I had just caused in the real world. "Chef, you okay?" Marcus asked, already moving to clean up the mess. I nodded, not trusting my voice, but I wasn't okay. The delayed me in the pot's reflection had looked up at that moment, and for the first time, he seemed to see me too. His eyes met mine through the curved steel surface, and he smiled, an expression I hadn't made, a reaction that belonged to him alone. That night I stayed late after service, long after the last customer had left and the cleaning crew had finished their work. The restaurant felt different in the empty hours, full of shadows that seemed to move independently and sounds that had no obvious source. I made my way to the copa with deliberate steps, my heart hammering against my ribs. The television was already on. I hadn't turned it on. I was certain I hadn't touched the remote. But there it was, glowing in the dim break room. And there I was on screen. Not delayed this time, but perfectly synchronized with my movements. When I raised my hand, so did he. When I stepped closer to the screen, so did he. We were moving in perfect unison, as if the 3-second gap had finally closed. But something was wrong with his eyes. They held an intelligence, an awareness that seemed separate from my own thoughts. When I blinked, he held his eyes open just a fraction longer. When I tilted my head, he tilted his at a slightly different angle, small deviations that grew more pronounced with each passing moment. I reached for the remote to turn off the television, but stopped when I saw that the other me was reaching for something different, something off camera that I couldn't see. His hand moved with purpose, grasping at empty air in my world but clearly interacting with objects in his. The delayed me had become something else entirely. Not a reflection or a recording, but a separate entity living parallel to my existence, 3 seconds out of phase with reality. And now, as I watched in growing horror, he was beginning to influence the world around him in ways I couldn't predict or control. The screen flickered once, twice, then stabilized. The other me looked directly at the camera, directly at me, and mouthed words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. He was trying to tell me something urgent and important about the nature of our connection. But before I could make sense of his silent message, the screen went black. Not turned off, but black as if the signal had been cut from somewhere else entirely. In the darkness of the Copa, surrounded by the industrial hum of the restaurant's overnight operations, I realized that the real question wasn't whether what I was seeing was real or imaginary. The real question was, which one of us was the original, and which one was the 3-second delay. As I stood in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of the empty restaurant settling around me, I became acutely aware that somewhere, in a Copa 3 seconds behind or ahead of mine, another version of myself was asking the exact same question, and neither of us would ever know the answer. Story 4. The moving truck had left tire marks on Uncle Robert's new driveway, fresh black scars on pristine concrete that somehow looked more permanent than temporary. I stood at the front door, my finger hovering over the doorbell, watching those marks through the corner of my eye. Something about them felt deliberate, like a signature left behind by someone who wanted to be remembered. The house itself seemed to exhale as I finally pressed the button. A hollow chime echoed somewhere deep inside, followed by the sound of footsteps that were too quick, too eager. When Robert opened the door, his smile was the kind I recognized from my advertising days, forced brightness masking something that didn't want to be seen. "Marcus, you made it." His handshake lingered a beat too long, his palm damp despite the October chill. Come in. Still getting everything sorted, but the bones of the place are good." The bones. An odd way to describe a house, but as I stepped inside, the phrase felt accurate. The walls were stark white, freshly painted but somehow hollow-looking, like skin stretched too tight over a frame. Boxes labeled in Robert's precise handwriting lined the hallway. Kitchen, bedroom, office. Each word written with the careful control of someone trying to impose order on chaos. "Sorry about the mess," Robert said, though there was no mess. Just those boxes standing at attention like soldiers awaiting deployment. Moving at my age isn't what it used to be. Thought I'd have more energy, more purpose. His voice trailed off as we walked deeper into the house. The living room was spacious but felt compressed, as if the air itself had weight. A single chair sat in the center, facing away from the windows, toward the kitchen doorway. No television, no coffee table, no signs of life beyond that solitary piece of furniture positioned like a watchtower. "Minimalist phase," Robert explained when he caught me staring. "After Margaret, well, you strip things down to what matters, what you actually need." Margaret, his wife of 30 years, gone 6 months now. I'd missed the funeral, trapped in meetings about cereal commercials and car insurance taglines. The guilt had been gnawing at me since, part of why I'd driven 3 hours to visit him in this new place he'd chosen to start over. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee? Water?" Robert moved toward the kitchen, then stopped abruptly, his body tensing like a dog catching an unfamiliar scent. "Actually, maybe we should sit in here first. Get caught up." But I was already walking toward the kitchen, drawn by curiosity and something else. A subtle wrongness in the air, like the moment before a storm when animals go quiet. The kitchen was completely empty, not just of people, but of everything. No appliances, no cabinets, no dishes. Just white walls, white floor, white ceiling, and a single window that looked out onto a backyard filled with moving boxes the crew had apparently abandoned. "Haven't gotten around to setting it up yet," Robert said behind me, but his voice sounded strained. "The basics are still in boxes." I nodded, turning back toward him, when the first sound hit. Clink. Clear. Distinct. Unmistakable. the sound of ceramic meeting ceramic. A coffee mug being set down on a counter maybe, or plates being stacked. But there was nothing in the room to make such a sound. Robert's face went pale. "You heard that?" Before I could answer, it came again. Clink. Two pieces of dishware touching, then separating. Then a softer sound, like silverware being sorted in a drawer that didn't exist. What the hell? I stepped back into the kitchen, scanning every corner, every surface. Empty. Completely empty. But the sounds continued. A symphony of domestic activity in a room devoid of anything that could create it. Robert grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in with surprising strength. "It's been happening since I moved in. Every day, same time. 3:15 in the afternoon." I checked my phone. 3:16 p.m. Clink, clink, clink. The sounds were getting more pronounced, more rhythmic. Not random kitchen noise, but something with pattern, with purpose. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app, hitting record. The microphone would pick up whatever was causing this, some kind of settling in the pipes maybe, or vibrations from the house next door. The recording showed only an empty kitchen, silent and still. But standing there, we could both hear it clearly. Dishes moving, being arranged, cleaned, put away. The sounds of someone preparing a meal in a kitchen that had never held a meal. "Play it back," Robert whispered. I stopped recording and immediately hit play. Static. Nothing but a low, steady hiss, white noise that could have been air conditioning or electrical interference. No dishes, no movement, nothing. "That's impossible." I recorded again, this time holding the phone closer to where the sounds seemed strongest. The noise continued around us, now including what sounded like running water from a non-existent faucet. But the playback showed the same result. Silence disguised as static. "I've tried everything," Robert said, his voice barely audible above the phantom kitchen orchestra. "Different phones, a digital recorder, even hired a guy with professional equipment. Same thing every time. Nothing." The sounds began to fade, like someone finishing their work and moving to another room. Within minutes, the kitchen returned to its hollow quiet, leaving only the smell of something. Not quite food, not quite cleaning products. Something organic and warm, like breath in cold air. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "Since the first day. The movers had just left and I was standing exactly where you are now, wondering where to start unpacking when it began." Robert ran his hands through his thinning hair. "I thought it was stress, you know, grief playing tricks, but it's too consistent, too real." We walked back to the living room, but I found myself glancing over my shoulder at the kitchen doorway. The sounds had stopped, but something else had replaced them, a feeling of being observed. Not by Robert, but by something in that empty room, something that had just finished its daily routine and was now watching us discuss it. "Have you talked to the previous owners?" I asked, settling into the chair's companion, a folding chair Robert had apparently brought from his old place. "Family estate sale. Old woman lived here alone for 40 years after her husband died. The neighbors said she used to cook elaborate meals right up until the end, even though she ate alone." Robert's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "They found her in the kitchen. Natural causes, they said. Peaceful." The afternoon light was shifting, casting long shadows through the windows. I found myself listening for sounds from the kitchen, but it remained quiet. The kind of quiet that feels temporary, like an intermission rather than an ending. "Show me the recording again," Robert said. "But slow it down, way down." I pulled up the video and accessed the editing features, sliding the playback speed to its lowest setting. The static hiss deepened, becoming almost melodic, and underneath it, thump, thump, thump. Rhythmic, steady, unmistakable, not dishes at all, but something far more disturbing. A heartbeat, strong and consistent, echoing through the white noise at exactly the tempo of my own pulse. Jesus Christ. I let the phone drop to my lap, my own heart suddenly thundering in my chest. "That's not possible." Robert leaned forward, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and vindication. You hear it too, don't you? It's not just the kitchen sounds. There's something else, something underneath. I played it again, counting the beats. 68 per minute, exactly matching the rhythm I could feel in my temples, in my wrists, in the hollow of my throat. As if the recording had somehow captured not the sounds of an empty room, but the very pulse of whoever was listening. It's my heartbeat, I whispered. It's recording my heartbeat. No, Robert said quietly. It's recording hers. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I looked around, suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow, every corner where someone might be standing just out of sight. The feeling of being watched had intensified, no longer coming from the kitchen but from everywhere at once. The walls, the ceiling, the space between my shoulder blades. Whose heartbeat? But even as I asked, I knew he meant the old woman, the one who had died in the kitchen, who had spent 40 years cooking alone in that empty white room. I've timed it every day since I moved in. Same rhythm, same strength. Sometimes it matches mine, sometimes it doesn't. But it's always there, underneath the other sounds. Like she's still... He gestured helplessly toward the kitchen. Like she's still here, still living her routine. I stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, the abandoned moving boxes sat in the fading daylight like tombstones in a neglected cemetery. The rational part of my mind, the part trained to sell products and solve problems, scrambled for explanations. Audio compression artifacts, electromagnetic interference, some kind of feedback loop between the phone's microphone and speaker. But my body knew better. My heart was racing now, no longer matching the rhythm from the recording but fighting against it, like two metronomes trying to synchronize. The feeling of being watched had become so intense that I couldn't stand still, couldn't focus on any one spot without feeling eyes boring into my back. You have to leave this place, I told Robert. This isn't healthy. This isn't normal. Where would I go? His voice was smaller now, older. This is what I can afford. This is what's left. I turned back to face him and froze. Robert was sitting perfectly still in his chair, but his lips were moving silently, forming words I couldn't hear. His eyes were fixed on something behind me, something in the kitchen doorway, and his expression was one of recognition. Not fear, but familiarity, like greeting an old friend. Slowly, I turned around. The kitchen doorway was empty, but the air in front of it shimmered slightly, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. And underneath the growing dusk, I could swear I heard breathing, not Robert's, not mine, but something else, something patient and steady, keeping time with that recorded heartbeat still echoing in my mind. She's not trying to scare us, Robert said, his voice distant and dreamy. She's just continuing. Same time every day, same routine. She doesn't know she's gone. The shimmer in the doorway seemed to pulse, growing stronger and then fainter, like a signal trying to tune itself in. I backed toward the front door, my rational mind finally surrendering to the primal urge to run. But Robert remained seated, calm now in a way that was more frightening than his earlier fear. You could stay for dinner, he said conversationally. She always makes enough for two. I was at the front door now, my hand on the knob, when the kitchen sounds started again, but this time they were different. Not the careful, solitary sounds of someone working alone, but the bustling activity of someone preparing a meal for guests. Multiple plates being set out, silverware for two, the scrape of chairs being arranged around a table that didn't exist. The shimmer in the doorway had resolved into something almost solid now, a presence that seemed to be looking back and forth between Robert and me, as if trying to decide how much to set the table for. I have to go, I managed, turning the doorknob. Of course, Robert said pleasantly. But you'll come back, won't you? She likes having company. We both do. I stepped outside into the cool evening air, my heart hammering against my ribs. Behind me, the sounds from the kitchen continued, now clearly the noise of a dinner being prepared, complete with the soft murmur of conversation between voices I couldn't quite make out. I didn't run to my car, but I didn't walk slowly either. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced back at the house. Robert was visible through the living room window, no longer alone in his chair. The space beside him wasn't empty anymore. Something was sitting there, something that cast just enough of a shadow to be noticed, but not enough to be defined. I drove for 20 minutes before I realized I was still holding my breath. The recording is still on my phone. I've listened to it dozens of times since that day, always with the speed turned down, always hearing that steady heartbeat underneath the static. Some nights when I'm lying in bed trying to sleep, I swear I can feel it. Not just hear it, but feel it in my chest, as if something is trying to synchronize my pulse with its own. I called Robert the next day, and the day after that. The phone rings 4 times and goes to voicemail, but sometimes, if I listen carefully to the background noise, I can hear them. The sounds of dishes being washed, a table being set, quiet conversation over a meal that shouldn't exist. I haven't driven back to check on him. I tell myself it's because I'm busy, because the 3-hour drive isn't practical, because he seemed happy in that final moment when I saw him through the window. But the truth is simpler and more disturbing. I'm afraid of what I might find. I'm afraid I'll arrive at 3:15 in the afternoon and hear my own heartbeat echoing from that empty kitchen, calling me to stay for dinner at a table set for 3. And I'm afraid that this time, I might say yes. Story 5. The sound came first, a dull thud that pulled me from the depths of sleep like a fishing hook dragging through murky water. My studio apartment, barely larger than a generous closet, amplified every noise. The building was old, constructed when privacy meant something different, when walls were suggestions rather than barriers. I'd grown accustomed to the symphony of urban living, Mrs. Chen's television bleeding through the thin drywall, the couple upstairs whose arguments crescendoed at precisely 2:30 each morning, the subway rumbling beneath us like some mechanical leviathan digesting the city's bones. But this sound was different, immediate, intimate. It resembled the gallop of something large moving on 4 legs, rapid, purposeful strikes against the hardwood floor beside my bed. The rhythm was too deliberate to be settling pipes, too heavy to be rodents. My eyes remained closed, that peculiar stubbornness of the recently awakened refusing to acknowledge consciousness, but my other senses sharpened with predatory focus. The air in the room felt different, thicker, as if something massive had displaced the normal oxygen content, leaving behind a humid weight that pressed against my skin. The familiar scent of my apartment, coffee grounds, old books, the faint staleness of infrequent cleaning, had been contaminated by something else, something organic and wild, like wet fur and earth after rainfall. My eyelids fluttered open against my better judgment. The shadow stood where no shadow should exist. Beside my bed, perhaps 3 feet from where I lay, a darkness had taken shape that defied every law of physics I'd learned in my undergraduate years. It rose from the floor in a configuration that hurt to comprehend, an elongated mass that should have been horizontal, positioned on 4 legs like every mammal I'd ever encountered, but instead stretched upward in a vertical column that bent at an angle that seemed to mock the very concept of spinal structure. The thing was tall, taller than any person had a right to be in a room with 8-foot ceilings. Its uppermost portion, what I assumed must be a head, though it bore no recognizable features, nearly touched the water-stained plaster above. The middle section twisted in a way that suggested broken bones healing incorrectly, creating a helical spiral that made my vision blur when I tried to follow its contours. I held my breath, every muscle in my body locked in paralysis that felt both voluntary and imposed. The shadow remained motionless, as if it too was waiting, though for what I couldn't fathom. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time had become elastic in that small room, stretching and contracting according to the rhythm of my thundering heartbeat. Then it moved. Not walked, not stepped. Moved. The entire form shifted slightly to the left, maintaining its impossible vertical orientation while seeming to flow rather than reposition. The sound that accompanied this movement was wrong in ways I struggled to articulate even to myself. It was wet and dry simultaneously, like leather being slowly peeled from damp stone, combined with the subtle crackling of joints adjusting under immense pressure. My rational mind, the part that had earned a master's degree in engineering, that understood load-bearing calculations and structural integrity, scrambled for explanations. A coat hanging on the back of my chair, distorted by sleep-addled perception, and the orange streetlight filtering through my single window. A trick of shadows created by the building's exterior architecture. The lingering fragments of a dream bleeding into consciousness. But my body knew better. My skin had erupted in goosebumps that had nothing to do with temperature. The fine hairs on my arms and neck stood at attention like soldiers preparing for an assault they couldn't see coming. Every primitive instinct inherited from ancestors who survived by recognizing when they were being hunted screamed that I was no longer alone in my sanctuary. The shadow turned what might have been its head toward me. I clamped my eyes shut with such force that phosphonies exploded across the darkness behind my lids. Brilliant bursts of false light that painted nonsensical patterns in my visual cortex. The childish logic that claimed monsters couldn't hurt you if you couldn't see them took control, despite my adult understanding of its absurdity. But closing my eyes only heightened my other senses. I could hear something that might have been breathing, if breathing involved multiple chambers inflating and deflating in sequence, creating a subtle wheeze that reminded me of old bellows working air through a fireplace. The sound was too complex for human lungs, too rhythmic to be mechanical. Worse still was the smell that had intensified during my moment of visual denial. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was utterly foreign, like nothing I'd encountered in 32 years of urban existence. It carried notes of wilderness that had no business in a fourth-floor apartment, pine needles and moss, wet earth and something that might have been musk if musk could develop cancerous growths. I forced my eyes open again, driven by the same compulsion that makes people stare at automobile accidents. The shadow had moved closer. Now it loomed directly over my bed, positioned where someone might stand if they were examining a sleeping form with scientific curiosity. The twisted middle section of its body swayed slightly, as if it were fighting against gravity, or perhaps conducting some internal debate about its next action. My throat had constricted to the diameter of a drinking straw, making each breath a conscious effort that produced a faint wheeze. I wanted to speak, to demand an explanation or beg for mercy, but my vocal cords had apparently declared independence from my central nervous system. Instead, I lay frozen beneath my thin blanket, watching this impossible geometry of darkness study me with what I assumed was focused attention. The thing's head, or the region I had designated as its head, tilted at an angle that would have snapped a human neck. The movement was slow, deliberate, like a dog hearing a sound that existed just beyond the range of human perception. For a terrifying moment, I wondered if it was responding to something else in the room, something I couldn't detect but that posed an even greater threat than the shadow itself. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. They were unmistakably human, the familiar rhythm of someone climbing stairs after a long day, accompanied by the jingle of keys and the soft curse that followed dropping something. Probably. Sarah from 4B, returning from her bartending shift at the place downtown that stayed open until 3. The shadow's attention shifted toward my door with predatory focus. Its entire form seemed tense, though I couldn't identify specific muscles or anatomical features that would account for this impression. It was more like watching a spider prepare to pounce, where the change in posture communicated deadly intent through mechanisms that bypassed rational analysis. The footsteps stopped directly outside my door. For several heartbeats, the only sound was my own breathing, shallow, rapid inhalations that I tried unsuccessfully to quiet. The shadow remained motionless, angled toward the door like a hunting dog pointing at hidden prey. Then I heard Sarah's key sliding into her lock, followed by the familiar squeak of her door opening and closing. Her apartment was silent after that, leaving me alone again with my impossible visitor. But when I turned back to examine the shadow, it was gone. The space beside my bed was empty, filled only with the mundane darkness that belonged in a small apartment at 3 a.m. The air had returned to its normal composition, stale but breathable, carrying the familiar sense of my confined existence. The oppressive weight that had pressed against my skin had lifted, leaving behind only the memory of its presence. I sat up in bed, my muscles protesting after their extended period of paralysis. The movement felt strange, as if I were relearning how to control my own body. I reached for the lamp on my nightstand, my fingers trembling as they found the switch. Yellow light flooded the room, revealing the mundane reality of my studio apartment. My desk chair sat empty in its usual position. No coat hung from its back. I'd forgotten that my jacket was in the laundry basket beside my dresser. The floor showed no evidence of any visitor, impossible or otherwise. The window remained closed and locked, its glass reflecting my own pale face back at me like an accusation. I remained awake until dawn, sitting upright in bed with the lamp illuminated, studying every corner of my small domain for signs of intrusion or disturbance. But the apartment revealed nothing unusual, nothing that couldn't be explained by normal wear and the accumulated debris of solitary living. When morning arrived, painting my single window with gray light filtered through urban smog, I almost convinced myself that the entire episode had been a particularly vivid nightmare. The mind, I reminded myself, was capable of extraordinary deceptions, especially during the transitional moments between sleep and consciousness. Hypnagogic hallucinations were well-documented phenomena. Sleep paralysis could create sensory experiences that felt absolutely real to the person experiencing them. I showered, made coffee, and prepared for another day at the engineering firm where I spent my waking hours calculating the load-bearing capacity of structures designed to shelter human beings from the elements and whatever else might lurk beyond the walls. But as I was leaving for work, I noticed something that made my hand freeze on the doorknob. 4 distinct marks on the hardwood floor beside my bed. Deep gouges in the wood that arranged themselves in a pattern that could have been made by claws, or hooves, or something that combined characteristics of both in a configuration that had no name in any zoological taxonomy I knew. The marks were fresh. The exposed wood was lighter than the surrounding floor, indicating that whatever had created them had done so recently. Very recently. I knelt beside the gouges, running my finger along their edges. They were too deep to have been made by furniture legs, too precisely arranged to be the result of normal wear. Their spacing suggested something large, larger than any domestic animal that might have wandered into a 4th-floor apartment, through means I couldn't begin to imagine. Standing up, I examined my apartment again with different eyes. The single window remained locked from the inside. The door showed no signs of forced entry. The fire escape outside my window was accessible only to residents of the upper floors, and it would have required considerable effort to reach my apartment from that direction. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Something had been in my room during the night. Something had left physical proof of its presence in the form of marks that would cost me most of my security deposit to repair. I called in sick to work that day, spending the time researching urban wildlife, break-in statistics, and the structural integrity of old apartment buildings. I examined every possible conventional explanation for what I had experienced, following each thread of logic until it led to an inevitable dead end. By evening, I had convinced myself that some rational explanation existed, even if I couldn't identify it immediately. Perhaps a maintenance worker had been in my apartment the previous day, moving furniture in a way that created the marks. Perhaps my memory of the shadow was a false reconstruction, my brain's attempt to create a narrative that explained the strange sounds and sensations I had experienced during a particularly vivid dream. But as darkness settled over the city again, my confidence began to erode. I prepared for sleep with the meticulous care of someone expecting visitors. I checked the locks on my door and window multiple times. I positioned my furniture so that nothing could cast shadows in the configuration I remembered from the previous night. I even went so far as to place a small digital camera on my dresser, aimed at the space beside my bed, though I wasn't entirely certain I wanted to see whatever it might record. Sleep came reluctantly, interrupted by every sound from the building's normal nocturnal symphony. Each time I drifted toward unconsciousness, some noise would pull me back. The building settling, pipes expanding with temperature changes, the distant rumble of late-night traffic. But eventually, exhaustion overcame vigilance. I woke to the same dull thud. This time, I kept my eyes closed, but I could feel its presence immediately. The air pressure had changed again, becoming thick and humid despite the fact that my apartment's heating system barely functioned during the best of circumstances. The smell had returned as well, that impossible combination of wilderness scents that had no business existing in an urban environment. The thing was closer now. I could sense its proximity without seeing it, the way you might feel someone standing too near during a crowded subway ride. My skin prickled with the certainty that I was being observed, studied, perhaps cataloged for some purpose I couldn't comprehend. I forced myself to remain motionless, to continue the steady breathing pattern of deep sleep while my heart hammered against my ribcage with enough force to shake my entire body. Minutes passed in this state of suspended animation, predator and prey, locked in a dance where the rules remained unclear to one of the participants. Then I felt something that made every rational thought in my head scatter like startled birds. Breath against my face. It was warm and humid, carrying that alien scent directly into my nostrils and lungs. The rhythm was wrong. Too slow for a human, too complex for any animal I could identify. Each exhalation seemed to emerge from multiple sources, as if several beings were breathing in careful coordination just inches from my face. My eyes snapped open involuntarily. The shadow's head hovered directly above mine, close enough that I could have reached up and touched whatever passed for its features, if I'd possessed the courage or the madness required for such an action. In the darkness, I could make out no details of its construction, only the sense of vast size and wrongness that accompanied its presence. We stared at each other, or at least I stared while it presumably observed me through whatever sensory organs it possessed. The moment stretched between us like a tightrope over an abyss, fragile and balanced on the edge of some transition that would change everything. Then it spoke. Not with words exactly. The sound that emerged from somewhere within its twisted form was too complex for human language, too organic for any artificial communication system. It was something between a whisper and a growl, a wet sound that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly within my skull. But somehow, impossibly, I understood its meaning. You see me now. The words formed in my mind without passing through my auditory system, arriving as fully formed concepts that carried emotional weight far beyond their simple content. There was satisfaction in the communication, and something that might have been approval, as if I had passed some test that I hadn't known I was taking. Good. We can begin. My mouth opened to respond, to ask the questions that crowded my throat like prisoners fighting for freedom, but the shadow was already moving. It flowed backward, maintaining its impossible vertical orientation, while somehow conveying the impression of retreat. Within seconds, it had repositioned itself in the corner of my room, where it stood motionless in a space that should have been too small to accommodate something of its apparent size. I lay in bed, staring at this new arrangement, my mind cycling through explanations and rejecting each one with increasing desperation. The shadow remained in the corner until dawn, a presence that I could feel even when I wasn't looking directly at it, like a weight pressing against the edge of my peripheral vision. When morning light finally penetrated my window, the shadow didn't disappear gradually the way normal darkness retreated before the sun. Instead, it simply ceased to exist between one moment and the next, leaving behind only the familiar geometry of my corner where a filing cabinet stood next to a small bookshelf. But something had changed. The apartment felt different now, not invaded exactly, but altered in some fundamental way that I couldn't articulate. It was as if the space had been marked, claimed, designated for a purpose that remained unclear, but carried implications that made my skin crawl with anticipatory dread. The camera I had positioned the previous evening showed nothing unusual when I reviewed its footage. 8 hours of static recording revealed only an empty room with normal shadows cast by normal furniture. Yet I knew with absolute certainty that something had been present, something that either existed outside the electromagnetic spectrum that digital sensors could detect or possessed the ability to edit its presence from recorded media. Over the following days, the visits became routine. Each night the shadow would return, taking up its position first beside my bed, then retreating to the corner where it would remain until dawn. Our interaction was limited to that single exchange. "You see me now. We can begin." But I could feel it studying me with each visit, gathering information for some purpose that remained frustratingly opaque. I stopped sleeping entirely for 3 days, surviving on coffee and the kind of artificial alertness that comes from pushing human physiology beyond its designed limits. But exhaustion eventually claimed victory, and I would wake to find the shadow in its usual position, watching me with what I had come to interpret as patient persistence. My work performance deteriorated rapidly. Colleagues began commenting on my appearance, the dark circles under my eyes, the nervous habits I'd developed, the way I would stop mid-sentence and stare at corners of rooms where shadows gathered in perfectly normal configurations. I started taking long lunch breaks, using the time to research urban legends, paranoia, and the documented cases of shared psychotic episodes that might explain what was happening to me. But deep down, beneath the layers of rationalization and desperate searching for conventional explanations, I knew that what I was experiencing transcended the categories that human knowledge had established for understanding reality. The shadow was real. It existed in some form that operated according to rules I didn't understand, serving purposes that remained hidden from my limited perspective. And somehow, I had become part of whatever process it was conducting in my small apartment. 3 weeks after the first encounter, the nature of our relationship changed again. I woke not to the familiar thud, but to the sensation of being gently shaken. My eyes opened to find the shadow's head positioned close to mine, one appendage that might have been an arm or a tentacle resting on my shoulder with surprising gentleness. "Time to go," it communicated, the concepts arriving in my mind with the same direct clarity as before. Without conscious decision, I found myself sitting up and then standing beside my bed. My body moved with a fluidity that felt alien, as if someone else was operating my nervous system, while I observed from a passenger seat in my own skull. The shadow stepped back to give me room, then gestured toward my apartment door with a limb that changed shape as I watched, flowing from something resembling an arm to a configuration that had more in common with a snake, or perhaps a length of rope made from living tissue. I walked to the door, my bare feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. My hand turned the deadbolt and opened the door without any input from my conscious mind. The hallway beyond was dark and empty, lit only by the emergency exit sign at the far end. But as I stepped into the corridor, I realized that the building had changed. The familiar walls were still present, but they stretched far higher than the building's actual architecture would allow. The ceiling had become a distant suggestions somewhere in the darkness above, and the hallway extended much further in both directions than the physical structure could accommodate. Other shadows moved in this expanded space, tall, vertical forms that maintained the same impossible geometry as my nightly visitor. They stood in doorways that belonged to apartments I knew didn't exist, positioned at intervals along a corridor that had somehow grown to accommodate them. My shadow guide moved behind me, its presence a gentle pressure against my back that encouraged forward movement. We walked together down this transformed hallway, passing dozens of the vertical beings who turned their attention toward me as I passed. I could feel their observation like weight settling on my skin, not hostile but intensely curious, as if I were a novel specimen being examined by experts in a field I couldn't comprehend. At the end of the corridor, where there should have been a wall containing the stairwell access, a door stood open. Beyond it lay not the familiar staircase, but a space that my mind refused to properly process. It was simultaneously vast and intimate, filled with a soft light that seemed to emerge from no identifiable source. My guide paused at the threshold, turning its head toward me, in what I interpreted as an invitation. The communication that followed was more complex than our previous exchanges, carrying layers of meaning that my conscious mind struggled to unpack. "This is where you learn what you are becoming. This is where we show you what has always been true. This is where you choose whether to return to the small room and the small life, or to understand the larger pattern of which you have always been a part." I stood at the threshold, my bare feet on the cold floor of a corridor that couldn't exist in a building I thought I knew, facing a choice between worlds that my education had never prepared me to recognize. Behind me lay my studio apartment with its familiar constraints and reliable limitations. Ahead lay something that challenged every assumption I had made about the nature of reality, offering knowledge that would transform my understanding of existence in ways that felt both terrifying and necessary. The shadow waited with infinite patience for my decision, while around us, the other vertical beings maintained their silent observation. Time seemed suspended in that impossible hallway, stretching to accommodate the weight of the choice before me. I looked back once at the space I had called home, then stepped forward into the light, leaving behind the person I had been for 32 years and embracing whatever I was meant to become. The door closed behind me with a sound like thunder, or perhaps like the beating of enormous wings. When the police found my apartment 3 days later, responding to complaints about a smell coming from 4A, they discovered a space that showed no signs of struggle or disturbance. My personal belongings remained exactly where I had left them. The bed was unmade, as if I had simply risen one morning and walked away from my life. The only unusual detail was a series of marks on the hardwood floor beside the bed. 4 deep gouges that formed a pattern the investigating officers couldn't explain. Their report noted the marks as possible evidence of an animal presence, though no animal hairs or other biological traces were discovered anywhere in the apartment. My disappearance was filed as a missing person case that generated brief local media attention before fading into the statistical background noise of urban life. Friends and colleagues offered theories about stress-induced breakdown, financial difficulties, or a planned escape from responsibilities that had become overwhelming. But sometimes, in the early hours before dawn, residents of the building report hearing footsteps in the 4th floor hallway. They describe the sound of multiple individuals walking together, their pace measured and purposeful, moving toward the stairwell that leads to floors that shouldn't exist in a building of that height. The apartment remains empty, though prospective tenants occasionally inquire about the rental. Most lose interest after viewing the space, citing concerns about the lighting or the strange marks on the floor that the building's maintenance staff has been unable to sand away. A few, however, sign the lease despite these minor imperfections. They move in with enthusiasm, attracted by the affordable rent and the apartment's proximity to downtown amenities. And sometimes, after they've been living there for a few weeks, other residents notice that these new tenants begin to look tired. They develop dark circles under their eyes and nervous habits, involving the examination of corners where shadows gather. Their friends comment on their distracted behavior and their tendency to stare at empty spaces as if something invisible commands their attention. Then, one morning, their apartments are found empty, with no signs of struggle or disturbance. Only those same 4 marks on the hardwood floor, as if something large had stood beside the bed, waiting patiently for its tenant to understand what was being offered. The building continues to operate normally, housing its complement of urban professionals and students who navigate their daily lives without knowing that some units serve purposes beyond the simple provision of shelter. But if you listen carefully in the hours before dawn, you might hear footsteps in hallways that stretch further than any building's architecture should allow, moving toward destinations that exist in the spaces between what we choose to see and what waits patiently to be discovered. And somewhere in that expanded geography, in rooms lit by sources that cast no shadows, former tenants learn what they were becoming, what they had always been beneath the surface performances of ordinary human existence. The shadows continue their patient work, identifying those who possess the capacity to see beyond the comfortable boundaries of consensus reality. They wait beside beds in small apartments, studying sleeping scientific curiosity, until the moment when consciousness expands enough to acknowledge their presence. "You see me now," they whisper into minds that have finally developed the ability to receive their communication. "Good. We can begin." Story 6. The jam spill started 3 weeks ago. I've been working nights at Millbrook Bakery for 8 months now, and in all that time, I'd never seen anything like it. During my shift, everything remained pristine, the display cases gleaming under fluorescent lights, the tile floors spotless, the air thick with the lingering sweetness of tomorrow's pastries cooling on wire racks. But each morning when I arrived, I'd find these sticky, dark red pools scattered across the floor like abstract paintings of violence. Sarah, the day manager, mentioned it casually during our brief overlap that first Tuesday morning. Her voice carried the weary tone of someone dealing with yet another minor inconvenience. "Just cover them with some cardboard from the back room until I can get them properly cleaned," she instructed, already reaching for her coat. "The health inspector's coming by next week, and we can't have customers seeing that mess." The back room held towers of flattened boxes in various sizes, all bearing the faded logos of suppliers whose names I'd grown familiar with during my solitary hours. I selected pieces roughly the size of dinner plates, their corrugated surfaces still bearing creases from their previous lives, as containers for flour and sugar. The cardboard absorbed the jam's moisture with a soft whisper, darkening at the edges like wounds. That first week I placed maybe 6 or 7 pieces. The spills appeared in different locations each time. Near the entrance, behind the counter, in the narrow aisle between display cases. No pattern I could discern, no obvious source. I checked every jar in the store, examined every surface for signs of leakage, but found nothing. The jam simply appeared, as if materialized from the building's dreams. The second week brought more spills, and I found myself developing a routine. Arrive at midnight, check for new puddles, cover them with cardboard, begin the night's baking. The pieces I'd placed the previous evening were always gone by morning, supposedly removed by the cleaning crew that came before the day shift. I never saw them, though. My shift ended at 8, and theirs began at 6, creating a 2-hour window where the bakery existed in some liminal state between my jurisdiction and theirs. It was during the third week that I first noticed the arrangement. I'd been kneading dough for tomorrow's sourdough loaves, my hands working the familiar rhythm while my mind drifted to the mechanical sounds of the ovens preheating. The work required little conscious thought after so many months, leaving me free to listen to the building's nocturnal symphony. The hum of refrigeration units, the tick of cooling metal, the occasional groan of settling wood. When I stepped out from behind the prep counter to check the proofing baskets, I saw them. The cardboard pieces I'd placed earlier that evening had moved. Not far, maybe a few inches each, but enough to create something that made my pulse quicken. They formed letters, crude but unmistakable in their intent. REVIEW. I stood motionless, flour still coating my forearms, trying to process what my eyes insisted they were seeing. The words stretched across maybe 8 feet of floor space, each letter composed of multiple pieces of cardboard that had somehow migrated from their original positions covering jam spills. The pieces still bore the dark stains of their purpose, creating a message written in absorbed sweetness and shadow. My first instinct was to blame the wind, though I knew immediately how foolish that sounded. The bakery's windows remained sealed. The HVAC system merely whispered its climate-controlled breath, and cardboard doesn't simply drift into meaningful arrangements. Still, I told myself there had to be an explanation. Perhaps the cleaning crew had played a prank, though they'd never shown any inclination toward humor during our brief morning encounters. I photographed the arrangement with my phone, the camera's flash turning the darkened storefront into a tableau of harsh shadows and bright reflections. In the digital image, the word looked even more deliberate, more intentional. I sent the photo to Sarah with a message asking if she knew anything about it, then returned to my bread, trying to ignore the way the letters seemed to watch me from the periphery of my vision. Her response came an hour later. "Weird. Ask the cleaning crew tomorrow." But when morning arrived, the cardboard pieces were gone, and Marcus, the lead cleaner, insisted his team had never arranged anything. He gave me the look people reserve for those who might be losing their grip on reality, concerned but cautious, as if madness might be contagious. "We just throw them out," he explained, his accent making the words sound definitively final. "No games, no jokes. We clean, we go home." That night, I arrived early and methodically photographed each jam spill before covering it with cardboard. I documented their locations, measured distances between them, created a map of sorts on the back of a receipt. If something supernatural was occurring, I wanted evidence. If I was losing my mind, I wanted to understand how. The spills appeared in 9 locations that evening, more than ever before. I covered each one, noting its position on my improvised map, then settled into my routine with heightened awareness. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow deeper than usual. The familiar comfort of my nocturnal workspace had transformed into something expectant, pregnant with possibility. At 3:17 in the morning, I heard the first sound. It came from the dining area, a soft scraping, like furniture being dragged across tile. I abandoned the croissant dough I'd been laminating and moved toward the sound, my footsteps echoing despite my attempts at stealth. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their harsh illumination creating stark contrasts between light and shadow. The cardboard pieces were moving, not dramatically, not in any way that would convince a skeptic watching video footage. The movement was subtle, glacial, like the hands of a clock, imperceptible moment to moment but undeniable in its cumulative effect. A piece near the entrance shifted maybe half an inch toward another piece near the register. A corner lifted slightly, then settled. Another piece rotated a few degrees clockwise. I watched, transfixed as the word began to form again. REVIEW. But this time I could see the process. The deliberate choreography of corrugated cardboard arranging itself into meaning. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, but by the time I managed to activate the camera, the movement had stopped. The pieces lay innocently in their new positions, betraying nothing of their midnight migration. I reviewed the photos I'd taken earlier, comparing them to the current arrangement. The change was unmistakable, documented, real. Yet watching the footage I'd managed to capture showed nothing but static cardboard on a tile floor. Sleep became elusive during my days off. I found myself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the sound of cardboard scraping against tile. The word review echoed in my thoughts, its meaning shifting and expanding like a shadow cast by moving light. Review what? My life? My choices? My sanity? I researched the building's history, diving into public records and newspaper archives with the desperate energy of someone seeking rational explanation for the irrational. Millbrook Bakery occupied a space that had housed various businesses over the decades. A grocery store, a pharmacy, a small restaurant that lasted only 2 years. Nothing particularly dark or tragic, no convenient ghost story to explain my experience. The building itself dated to 1952, constructed during the post-war boom when the neighborhood still maintained hopes of becoming a thriving commercial district. Those hopes had largely faded, leaving behind a collection of businesses that served the immediate community but rarely attracted outsiders. The bakery represented one of the area's few success stories, though I suspected that success depended largely on the owner's willingness to work for minimal profit. During my 4th week of cardboard arrangements, the pattern changed. The jam spills appeared in new locations, no longer ran a rough circle in the center of the dining area. When I covered them with cardboard, I noticed the pieces fit together like puzzle segments, their irregular edges aligning with surprising precision. That night, instead of spelling review, they arranged themselves into a spiral, the pieces moving inward toward a center point that remained empty. The spiral troubled me more than the word had. Words possess meaning, purpose, communicative intent. Spirals suggest deeper forces, galaxies, whirlpools, the cochlea of the inner ear. They represent motion without destination, purpose without resolution. I began bringing additional equipment to work. A small digital recorder, a motion-activated camera I'd borrowed from my brother who used it for hunting. The recorder captured only the ambient sounds of the bakery and my own breathing, which grew increasingly rapid as the nights progressed. The camera triggered frequently but showed nothing more interesting than my own movements through the space. Yet each morning the spiral grew tighter, more complex. Additional pieces appeared during my shifts, seemingly materialized from nothing. I checked the supply of cardboard in the back room obsessively, counting pieces, looking for signs of depletion, but the stacks never seemed to diminish. Sarah began asking questions about my appearance, my performance, my general state of mind. Her inquiries carried the careful tone of a manager documenting concerns for HR purposes. I told her I'd been having trouble sleeping, which was true enough, though I omitted the reasons. Maybe you should take a few days off, she suggested. You've been working a lot of nights. Sometimes a person needs a break from the routine. But the routine had become my anchor, the only constant in an experience that defied consistency. The thought of staying away from the bakery filled me with anxiety that surprised me. What if the arrangements continued without me there to witness them? What if they stopped entirely, leaving me to wonder if they'd ever happened at all? I compromised by accepting a shorter schedule, 4 nights instead of 6, though I suspected this would only intensify whatever was occurring. Concentration creates pressure, and pressure changes things in ways we don't always predict. My first night back revealed a transformation that left me questioning everything I thought I understood about the situation. The jam spills had multiplied exponentially. Instead of the usual 6 to 10 puddles, I counted 43 distinct locations scattered throughout the bakery. The spills varied in size from drops barely larger than coins to irregular pools that stretched across multiple floor tiles. When I covered them with cardboard, the pieces formed not words or spirals, but something that resembled a map. Streets and intersections, buildings and empty lots. The cardboard pieces outlined the geography of the neighborhood surrounding the bakery. I recognized the layout immediately, having walked these streets countless times during my tenure. But this version included details I'd never noticed. Alleyways that didn't exist. Buildings positioned differently than memory suggested. Streets that curved where they should run straight. I photographed the arrangement from multiple angles, trying to capture its scope and complexity. The images revealed additional details invisible from ground level, patterns within patterns, connections between seemingly unrelated elements, a structure that implied intention far beyond random chance. Standing at the arrangement's center, I felt watched in a way that transcended paranoia. The sensation was specific, focused, as if something invisible occupied each piece of cardboard simultaneously. I turned slowly, scanning the darkened windows of surrounding businesses, looking for signs of observation. The reflection of fluorescent lights created false windows in the glass, suggesting movement where none existed. That was when I noticed the new jam spills. They appeared in real time, materializing on sections of floor that had been clean moments before. Not drops falling from an unseen source, but pools that simply existed where they hadn't before, as if the tile itself were bleeding sweetness. I watched 3 separate spills manifest in the space of 5 minutes, each one appearing with a soft sound like a sigh. My hands shook as I reached for more cardboard, though I wasn't sure why I continued the routine. The arrangement already covered most of the available floor space, creating a landscape of corrugated islands connected by narrow pathways of exposed tile. Adding more pieces would eliminate those pathways entirely, trapping me within the pattern. But I covered each new spill anyway, compelled by a logic I couldn't articulate. The additional pieces integrated seamlessly into the existing arrangement, filling gaps I hadn't noticed, completing connections that had seemed random. The map-like quality became more pronounced, more detailed, more resembling something that could actually be navigated. When I finished placing the last piece, the entire arrangement began to move. Not the subtle, almost imperceptible motion I'd observed before, but a coordinated shifting that reminded me of murmurations. Those spectacular bird flights where thousands of individuals move as a single organism. The cardboard pieces rotated, slid, lifted at their edges, creating waves of movement that flowed across the floor like water across sand. I stood transfixed in the center, surrounded by cardboard in constant motion, feeling simultaneously observer and participant in something I couldn't name. The pieces never touched me, never actually threatened any harm, but their movement generated a wind that carried the scent of cinnamon and vanilla and something darker I couldn't identify. The movement accelerated, the pieces spinning faster while maintaining their overall pattern. The sound grew from whisper to murmur, to something approaching song. Not quite music, but rhythmic and harmonious in ways that suggested intention. I closed my eyes, letting the sound wash over me, feeling my heartbeat synchronize with whatever tempo governed the cardboard's dance. When I opened my eyes, everything had stopped. The pieces lay motionless, arranged in a perfect reproduction of the neighborhood map, but with one crucial difference. At the exact center, where the bakery should have been, the cardboard formed a single word in letters large enough to read from anywhere in the room. Return morning came too quickly. Sarah arrived early, finding me still standing amid the cardboard arrangement, still trying to process what I'd witnessed. Her expression cycled through confusion, concern, and something approaching fear as she surveyed the scene. "What is this?" she asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure she wanted an answer. I began to explain, then stopped. How could I describe the movement, the sound, the sensation of being at the center of something vast and incomprehensible? How could I make her understand that the word return felt like both invitation and command? Instead, I helped her clear the pieces, stacking them in the back room while she called the cleaning crew to mop the floors. Marcus and his team arrived with expressions of barely concealed frustration, muttering about additional work and impossible schedules. They cleaned efficiently, erasing every trace of the night's events except for the photographs on my phone, and the memory burned into my perception. I haven't worked at the bakery since that night. Sarah granted my request for indefinite leave with relief that seemed disproportionate to the circumstances. I told her I needed time to address some personal issues, which was true in ways I couldn't fully explain. But I returned to the neighborhood regularly, walking past the bakery during various hours, observing from a distance. Sometimes I see lights on during what should be empty hours. Sometimes I notice figures moving inside, though the day staff insists no one has access after closing. Last week I saw cardboard pieces pressed against the inside of the front windows, arranged to spell a message visible from the street. Review complete. I don't know what was reviewed, or by whom, or what conclusions were reached. I don't know if the jam spills continue, or if some other night worker now covers them with cardboard, or if the arrangement process has moved beyond the need for human participation. But I know that sometimes, walking past in the early morning hours when the neighborhood balances between night and day, I hear the sound of cardboard scraping against tile, soft and rhythmic and impossibly purposeful. And I know that somewhere in that sound lies an invitation I'm not ready to accept, a return I'm not prepared to make, at least not yet. Story 7. The Whitmore estate had been abandoned for 3 years when I first set foot on its grounds that October morning. As an event producer, I'd organized gatherings in hundreds of venues, but this particular commission felt different from the moment I received the call. The client's voice had carried an urgency that seemed disproportionate to what should have been a routine corporate retreat setup. The mansion loomed against the overcast sky like a Gothic monument to decay. Its Victorian architecture, once grand, now wore the patina of neglect, paint peeling from ornate trim, ivy creeping across weathered stone, and windows that reflected nothing but emptiness. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of my footsteps on gravel and the distant whisper of wind through bare branches. I approached the main entrance, fumbling with the keys the client had provided. The heavy oak door protested with a groan that seemed to echo through the bones of the building itself. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of pale sunlight that filtered through grimy windows, and the air tasted of must and something else, something sweet and cloying that I couldn't quite identify. My footsteps echoed in the grand foyer as I began my initial survey. The client wanted the event held in exactly 2 weeks, which meant I had precious little time to assess what renovations would be necessary. Corporate executives, apparently, didn't mind a little atmospheric decay as long as the plumbing worked and the electrical systems could handle their presentation equipment. I moved through the rooms methodically, taking notes on my tablet and snapping photos of potential problem areas. The mansion was larger than I'd expected, with sprawling wings that seemed to extend endlessly in either direction. Each room held the ghostly imprint of its former grandeur: elaborate moldings, crystal chandeliers draped in cobwebs, and furniture shrouded in white sheets that looked like specters in the dim light. It was in the conservatory that I first caught sight of him. Through the wall of windows that faced the mansion's rear gardens, I spotted a figure seated on a wrought iron bench among the overgrown hedges. At first glance, he appeared to be a teenager, perhaps 16 or 17, wearing what looked like school clothes, dark slacks and a white shirt that seemed remarkably clean for someone sitting in an abandoned garden. What struck me as odd wasn't his presence exactly. Teenagers were known to explore abandoned properties, though I wondered how he'd gotten past the locked gates. What caught my attention was his absolute stillness and the deliberate, repetitive motion of his head as he appeared to be eating something. I watched him for several minutes, mesmerized by the rhythmic movement. He held what appeared to be a caramel apple, the kind sold at fall festivals, and his tongue moved across its surface in long, slow strokes. But something about the motion seemed wrong, too precise, too continuous. He never seemed to actually bite or consume any of the candy coating. Concerned that he might be trespassing, or worse, that he might be in some kind of distress, I made my way through the mansion's rear exit and into the garden. The overgrown paths were treacherous, forcing me to push through tangles of rose bushes that caught at my clothes with thorns like grasping fingers. As I drew closer, the sweet smell I'd detected in the mansion grew stronger, that cloying scent of caramelized sugar mixed with something else, something organic and unsettling. The teenager remained motionless, except for that continuous, rhythmic licking motion. "Hey there," I called out when I was still several yards away, not wanting to startle him. "You okay?" He didn't respond, or even acknowledge my presence. His profile was visible now, and I could see his features more clearly, pale skin that seemed almost translucent in the filtered sunlight, dark hair that hung limp around his face, and lips that moved against what I now realized was definitely a caramel apple. "Excuse me," I said, approaching more slowly. Something about the scene felt increasingly wrong, though I couldn't articulate why. "You're not supposed to be here. This is private property." Still no response. I was close enough now to see that his eyes were open but unfocused, staring straight ahead with an expression of vacant concentration. The motion of his tongue against the apple was hypnotic in its consistency, like watching a metronome or a pendulum. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked, genuine concern now overriding my initial irritation about trespassing. "Do you need help?" I reached out to touch his shoulder, and that's when I saw it clearly for the first time. The apple wasn't an apple at all. What he held in his pale hands was nothing more than a wooden stick, the kind used as handles for caramel apples. But there was no candy, no fruit, nothing but bare, weathered wood. And yet his tongue continued its deliberate motion, gliding across the empty stick as if the caramel coating were still there. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. As I stared in fascination and growing horror, I realized that his tongue itself seemed wrong. It appeared translucent, almost glass-like, catching the light in a way that human flesh never could. I could see through it to the garden beyond, as if it were made of clear plastic or water. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, stumbling backward. The teenager finally turned his head toward me, and his eyes, pale blue and completely without expression, fixed on mine. His mouth opened slightly, revealing that transparent tongue still moving in its endless rhythm, and he spoke a single word that seemed to come from very far away. "Sweet." I ran. My retreat through the overgrown garden was panicked and graceless, thorns tearing at my jacket and branches whipping across my face. I didn't stop until I was back inside the mansion, the rear door slamming shut behind me with a sound like a gunshot. My heart hammered against my ribs as I leaned against the door, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. There had to be a rational explanation. The kid was probably on drugs, some new synthetic compound that could cause hallucinations or bizarre behavior. The transparency effect with his tongue was just a trick of the light, my eyes playing tricks on me in the dim garden. People didn't just have transparent body parts. That was impossible. But even as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, I couldn't shake the image of that methodical licking motion, the vacant stare, and the way his voice had seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. I forced myself to continue my survey of the mansion, though my concentration was shot. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak of the old building's settling timbers made me jump. The sweet smell that had been subtle before now seemed overwhelming, filling every room with its cloying presence. In the main dining room, I found myself staring at the long mahogany table, imagining corporate executives seated around it for their retreat. Would they smell it too? Would they ask questions about the previous occupants? About why the mansion had been abandoned so suddenly? My research into the property had been minimal, just enough to ensure it was legally available and structurally sound. But now I found myself wondering about its history, about what had happened here to leave such an atmosphere of wrongness. I was photographing the ornate ceiling moldings when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere deeper in the mansion. It was barely audible at first, like the whisper of fabric against fabric. But as I stood perfectly still and listened, it resolved into something more recognizable. The sound of licking. Slow, wet, methodical, the same rhythm I'd observed in the garden. My tablet slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire building. The licking stopped immediately, leaving a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. I told myself it was just the old building settling, pipes creaking, or wind through loose shutters, but I knew better. I'd heard that exact rhythm before, watched it play out in the garden with my own eyes. The teenager was inside the mansion. My first instinct was to leave immediately, to call the client and inform them that the venue was unsuitable for their needs. But professional obligation warred with personal fear, and somehow the former won out. I had contracts to honor, deposits that had been paid, and a reputation to maintain. I couldn't simply abandon a job because of one strange encounter with what was probably just a disturbed kid. But I could expedite my survey. I moved through the remaining rooms quickly, taking only the most essential photos and notes. Every few minutes I would pause to listen, and more often than not, I would hear it, that soft, rhythmic sound echoing from somewhere in the mansion's depths. It seemed to move from room to room, sometimes coming from directly overhead, sometimes from below, and occasionally from right beside me, though I never saw the source. The smell of caramel grew stronger as the afternoon wore on, until it became nauseating in its intensity. I found myself breathing through my mouth, but even then I could taste it on my tongue, that artificial sweetness tinged with something organic and wrong. In the mansion's library, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Among the few books that remained on the shelves, I found a local newspaper from 3 years earlier, yellowed and brittle but still readable. The headline made my hands shake. Whitmore estate family vanishes without trace. According to the article, the Whitmore family, parents and their teenage son, had simply disappeared one autumn evening. Their car remained in the driveway, their belongings untouched, their dinner still warm on the table. Police had found no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, and no clues as to where they might have gone. The family had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed at all. There was a photograph accompanying the article, a family portrait taken the previous Christmas. The parents were unremarkable, but the teenage son sent ice shooting through my veins. Dark hair, pale skin, and those same vacant blue eyes I'd stared into just hours earlier in the garden. According to the newspaper, the boy's name had been Marcus Whitmore, and he'd been 17 years old when the family disappeared, the same age as the teenager with the transparent tongue. I dropped the newspaper and ran, no longer caring about professional obligations or client relationships. The sound of licking followed me through the mansion's corridors, seeming to come from the walls themselves now, and the smell of caramel was so overwhelming that I could barely breathe. I burst through the front door and didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys and gunning the engine before the doors were even fully closed. As I spun gravel backing out of the driveway, I caught a glimpse of movement in my rearview mirror. The teenager stood in the mansion's front doorway, still holding that wooden stick, still making that endless licking motion. But now I could see others behind him, shadowy figures that might have been adults, all of them perfectly still except for that same rhythmic movement. I called the client that evening to inform him that the Whitmore estate was unsuitable for his corporate retreat. I cited structural concerns and potential liability issues, though I never mentioned what I'd actually seen. He was frustrated but ultimately understanding, and we quickly found an alternative venue. But even now, 6 months later, I can't escape the memory of that afternoon. The smell of caramel still makes me nauseous, and I find myself unconsciously listening for that soft, rhythmic sound in quiet moments. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if what I saw was real, or if the stress of my job, the isolation of that empty mansion, and some undiagnosed neurological condition had combined to create an elaborate hallucination. The rational part of my mind insists that's the only possible explanation. But then I remember the newspaper, the photograph of Marcus Whitmore, and the absolute certainty in my bones that what I encountered in that garden was not alive in any way I could understand. And I remember the way his voice had sounded when he spoke that single word, not like sound traveling through air, but like an echo from somewhere far deeper than the throat, somewhere that shouldn't exist in any living person. The Whitmore estate was demolished last month. I learned about it through a business contact who mentioned the news in passing. Apparently, the new owners had decided the building was too far gone to salvage and had brought in wrecking crews to clear the land for development. But according to the workers, something strange had happened during the demolition. They'd found evidence of recent habitation in the building, fresh food in